I accidentally filmed Bigfoot on Christmas Eve, Minnesota, 2013. My name is Joseph. I never believed in Bigfoot. Not because I thought the stories were ridiculous. I just figured that after all these years, someone would have captured undeniable proof. Every blurry photo, every shaky video, they always looked fake to me. That changed on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 2013, northern Minnesota. I wasn't looking for a monster, I was just trying to film my family. My wife, Emily, and our 3 children had driven almost 5 hours from Minneapolis to my parents' cabin near the Superior National Forest. It had become our family tradition. Every Christmas, we escaped the city. No traffic, no phones constantly ringing, just snow, pine trees, and family. The cabin had belonged to my grandfather before my parents inherited it. It sat alone at the end of an old gravel road, surrounded by miles of dense forest. The nearest neighbor lived over 2 miles away. If you stepped outside after sunset, the silence felt alive. When we arrived around 3 in the afternoon, everything looked perfect. Fresh snow covered the ground. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney. My father was outside splitting firewood, while my mother decorated cookies with the kids. For a few hours, it felt like the perfect Christmas. I wish it had stayed that way. Around 4:30, the sun began disappearing behind the trees. Minnesota winters don't wait. 1 minute, it's afternoon. The next, it feels like midnight. I grabbed my Sony Handycam from the truck. Back then, I loved recording everything. Birthdays, vacations, Christmas. I always believed memories deserved more than photographs. I stepped outside and started filming. The kids were throwing snowballs at Grandpa. Emily laughed every time one accidentally hit him. Mom waved at the camera from the porch while pretending to scold the children. Everything looked ordinary, beautiful, peaceful. I slowly panned the camera across the property, the frozen lake, the tall pine trees, the old woodshed, then toward the forest. I wasn't focusing on anything, just capturing the scenery. As the camera swept across the tree line, something moved. At first I thought it was a deer. Then I realized it was standing upright, very upright. The figure was partially hidden between 2 massive pine trees, roughly 100 yards away. Dark, tall, covered in what looked like blonde dark brown hair. It wasn't moving like a bear. It wasn't shaped like a person wearing winter clothing either. Its shoulders looked impossibly broad. Its arms hung unusually low. I remember lowering the camera for just a second. When I looked with my own eyes, I couldn't see anything, just trees. I raised the camera again. The figure was still there, standing perfectly still, watching us. I whispered, "What the hell?" Before I could zoom in, it stepped behind a tree. Not quickly, not frightened, almost calmly, like it knew I had seen it. Then it disappeared. I waited. Nothing, just snow falling. The wind, silence. I honestly convinced myself it had been a trick of the light, until Duke started barking. Duke was my father's German shepherd, 10 years old. Smart, calm. He almost never barked without reason. But the moment I lowered the camera, he exploded. Bark, bark, bark. He sprinted across the yard toward the exact section of forest where I'd seen the figure. He stopped at the edge of the trees, his ears flattened, his tail tucked between his legs, yet he refused to back away. He barked continuously into the darkness, not at us, not at another animal we could see, at something hidden beyond the trees. Dad walked outside carrying an armload of firewood. What got into him? I pointed toward the woods. I think something's out there. Dad looked, saw nothing. Probably a deer. But Duke wasn't acting like he'd found a deer. His bark had changed. It sounded desperate, warning us. Emily stepped onto the porch holding our youngest daughter. "Joseph, bring him back." Something about her voice made me turn around. She wasn't looking at Duke. She was looking past him, toward the forest. "What?" She hesitated. "I thought." She shook her head. "Never mind." "No." "What did you see?" "I thought someone was standing out there." Every hair on my arms stood up because I hadn't told anyone what I'd seen. Not yet. That night after dinner, while everyone else wrapped presents and watched old Christmas movies, I connected the camera to my father's television. Mostly because I wanted to prove to myself I'd imagined everything. I fast-forwarded through the family footage. The snowball fight. The porch. The woods. Then I paused. There it was. Only this time, seeing it on a 40-inch television, I realized something I hadn't noticed outside. It wasn't behind the trees, it was between them, completely exposed. The camera had caught nearly 4 seconds of something that absolutely should not have been there. No winter jacket, no orange hunting vest, no backpack, no visible face, just a massive human-shaped figure covered in dark hair, standing motionless. Looking directly toward my family, the room went silent. My father leaned closer. Emily grabbed my arm. Mom whispered, "Who is that?" Nobody answered, because nobody knew. Then my oldest son quietly asked, "Dad, why is it so tall?" None of us had an answer. Outside, Duke started barking again. This time, much closer, and whatever was out there was no longer staying inside the trees. I survived one hunt in Alaska. My best friend never spoke about it again. There are people who spend their lives chasing trophies. Owen and I hunted for a different reason. We hunted because it reminded us how to breathe. My name is Michael. Owen and I served together in the Army years before either of us ever stepped foot into the Alaskan wilderness. We'd seen enough violence overseas to last several lifetimes. After returning home, crowded cities never felt right anymore. The mountains did. The forests did. Silence made more sense than conversation. Every autumn, we disappeared into Alaska for a week with nothing but rifles, backpacks, camping gear, and enough food to stay off the grid. That trip was supposed to be no different. It was late September. The mornings were cold enough to freeze the tops of puddles. The spruce forests smelled damp after days of light rain. Mist drifted through the valleys before sunrise, making the entire landscape feel older than civilization itself. Owen drove while I studied topographic maps spread across my lap. Our destination was nearly 40 miles from the nearest paved road. No cell phone service, no cabins, no hiking trails. Exactly the kind of place serious hunters loved. We reached the trailhead before daylight. Neither of us spoke much while unpacking. Military habits never disappear. Every movement had purpose. Check ammunition, check radio batteries, check compass, check bear spray, check emergency flare, check knives, double-check water filters. Only then did we shoulder our packs and begin hiking. The forest swallowed us within minutes. Hunting isn't exciting most of the time. Movies get that wrong. Real hunting is hours of walking slowly, watching the wind, studying broken branches, looking for fresh tracks, listening, always listening. By noon we'd found moose sign along a creek, large tracks, fresh droppings, tree bark stripped nearly 6 feet above the ground. Owen crouched beside one of the prints. "They're moving north." I nodded. "Probably feeding before winter." We followed carefully, not rushing, just reading the woods. The farther we walked, the quieter everything became. No ravens, no squirrels. Even the wind seemed muted beneath the towering spruce. After years in combat, you learn to notice silence, because silence usually means something already scared everything else away. Around 3 in the afternoon, we stopped beside a narrow stream. I boiled water while Owen scanned the tree line through binoculars. Neither of us said much. We didn't have to. We've spent enough years together to communicate with a glance. Then Owen lowered the binoculars. "You hear that?" I listened. "Nothing. Exactly nothing." "No birds," he nodded. "That's what bothers me." 5 minutes later we heard it. Knock, knock. 2 sharp impacts somewhere deep in the timber. It sounded like someone striking one tree against another. Not an axe, not gunfire. Wood against wood, far away. Then silence again. We looked at each other. Neither of us smiled. By evening we'd set camp beside a gravel bar overlooking the creek. Small fire, freeze-dried meals, coffee black enough to strip paint, normal routine, almost comforting. As darkness settled over camp, Owen reached into his pocket and pulled out an old photograph. His wife, 2 daughters. He looked at it every night on every hunting trip. Same ritual, same smile. "You ever think we're getting too old for this?" he asked. I laughed. "We're still faster than most 20-year-olds, he grinned. "Fair enough." The woods answered with another knock. Closer. 3 strikes this time. Knock, knock. Neither of us moved. The fire crackled. Nothing else. Just after midnight, I woke to footsteps, heavy, deliberate, not running, walking, crunch, crunch, crunch. Snow hadn't fallen yet. Those were boots, or something heavy enough to sound like boots. I quietly reached for my rifle. "Owen?" No answer. He was already awake, sitting upright, listening. The footsteps circled our campsite once, always staying beyond the firelight, never entering the clearing. Then they stopped, completely. For nearly 2 minutes, I remember thinking, whatever made those tracks was standing still, watching us. Then, one enormous shadow crossed between two trees, too tall for a man, too broad for a bear standing upright. It never stepped into the light. It simply continued into the darkness without making another sound. Neither of us fired. Neither of us spoke. We waited until sunrise. The next morning we packed camp without eating breakfast. Neither of us admitted it aloud, but we both wanted out. About a mile from camp, Owen suddenly stopped walking. He pointed toward the muddy bank of the creek. There, pressed into the soft ground, was a footprint. Human in shape, but impossibly large, nearly twice the length of Owen's hunting boot. The toes were clearly defined. No claw marks, no boot tread, just skin, deeply pressed into the mud. Beside it, another print, then another, each spaced nearly 6 feet apart. Neither of us stepped closer. Veterans learn not to contaminate evidence. Instead, Owen photographed the prints from multiple angles beside a measuring tape we carried for field dressing game. Neither of us joked. Neither of us suggested it was fake. We simply documented everything. Then we left. 3 days later, we reported what we'd found to the nearest Alaska State Trooper post. The officer listened politely, asked for our photographs, recorded the GPS coordinates, measured our boot sizes, asked whether we'd consumed alcohol, asked whether we'd encountered bears. Then he thanked us. That was it. Months later, an investigator contacted Owen asking for copies of the original image files because another hunting party had reported unusually large unidentified footprints less than 5 miles from the same drainage. No official explanation was ever released. The photographs were returned, no charges, no follow-up interview, no public statement. Owen never hunted that valley again. In fact, he rarely spoke about Alaska after that trip. The last time I asked him what he believed we had seen, he stared out his kitchen window for almost a minute before answering. I don't know what it was. He paused. But I know one thing. It knew we were there long before we knew it was watching. Years later, Owen passed away from natural causes. Among the belongings his family gave back to me was the same memory card from that hunting trip. The photographs of the footprints were gone. Not corrupted, not damaged, simply missing. Only one file remained, a blurry image of the spruce tree line taken just before sunrise. At first glance, it looked empty, until I enlarged the picture. Between two trees far in the background stood a dark silhouette, too tall to identify, too distant to confirm. When I showed the image to the detective who had originally handled our report, he looked at it for several seconds before sliding the photograph back across the table. He simply said, "I can't tell you what that is." Then he closed the case file. Officially, nothing unusual was ever found in that section of forest. Unofficially, every hunter in the nearest town still avoids that drainage after sunset. 8 campers entered the coast mountains. We still can't explain what followed. There were 8 of us. Not thrill seekers, not ghost hunters, just a group of experienced backpackers who spent nearly every summer exploring remote mountain ranges across Western Canada. Our destination that August was the Coast Mountains, a vast wilderness stretching along British Columbia where glaciers, alpine lakes, and endless forests can make even experienced hikers feel insignificant. We had spent months planning the trip. Maps were printed, GPS routes were downloaded, satellite messenger tested, weather forecasts checked. Everything was routine. Everything looked safe, at least on paper. Our group consisted of 8 people: Ryan and Claire, both wilderness first responders; Ben, a wildlife photographer; Tyler, who had climbed Denali 2 years earlier; Emma, a geology graduate student; Lucas, a former park ranger; Sophia, an environmental researcher; and me. I had organized dozens of backcountry trips before. Nothing about this expedition felt unusual. We met before sunrise in Squamish, loaded our gear into 2 trucks, and drove for nearly 4 hours before reaching the old logging road that marked the beginning of our route. From there, everything would be on foot. The first day was exactly what every backpacker hopes for: cool mountain air, crystal clear streams, fresh bear tracks that were already several days old, wildflowers covering the alpine meadows. The kind of scenery that convinces you civilization isn't nearly as beautiful as people claim. We hiked slowly. Nobody rushed. Every hour someone called for a short break to adjust packs, refill water bottles, or take photographs. Ben spent more time photographing mountain goats than actually walking. Claire laughed every time he disappeared behind another boulder chasing the perfect picture. By late afternoon, we found the perfect campsite beside a small glacial lake. Flat ground, fresh water, natural protection from the wind. Exactly where we planned to spend the night. The mood couldn't have been better. Tents went up quickly. Ryan collected firewood. Emma prepared dinner, while Lucas demonstrated the safest place to hang food bags away from camp. Experienced backpackers develop routines. Those routines become comforting, predictable, safe. That evening, the mountains became unbelievably quiet, not peaceful, quiet, the kind of silence where even whispering feels inappropriate. Ben noticed it first. "Where are the birds?" Nobody answered immediately because he was right. The entire afternoon we'd heard ravens, chickadees, and squirrels. Now, nothing. No insects, no birds, no distant animal calls. Only the occasional breeze moving through the spruce trees. Lucas frowned. "I've worked in parks for 12 years. I don't like forests that suddenly stop making noise." Ryan shrugged. "Maybe a predator's nearby." That explanation made sense. Mountain lions, black bears, even wolves. Nature has logical answers, usually. After dinner, we sat around the fire sharing stories from previous trips. Tyler joked about getting lost in Alaska. Claire teased Ryan for once mistaking a marmot for a bear. Everyone laughed. For a while, the strange silence faded into the background. Then we heard it, one sharp knock, like someone hitting a thick tree trunk with another piece of wood. Everyone stopped talking. A minute passed. Another knock, this time farther to our left. Lucas stood. "Did anyone else hear that?" All 7 of us nodded. Ben grabbed his camera. "Probably another camper." Lucas slowly shook his head. "There shouldn't be anyone else out here." According to the trail register, our group was the only party scheduled in that drainage. Night fell quickly. Temperatures dropped close to freezing. Everyone crawled into their tents shortly after 10. I remember checking my watch at exactly 12:41 a.m. because that was when I woke up. At first, I thought it was the wind. Heavy footsteps moved somewhere beyond the tents. Slow, deliberate, crunch, crunch, crunch. Not running, walking, large footsteps, one complete circle around our campsite. I reached for my headlamp. Before I switched it on, I heard another tent zipper open. It was Lucas. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "You hear it too?" I nodded. Neither of us turned on our lights. Whatever was outside stopped moving. The silence lasted nearly 30 seconds. Then came a low whistle. Not the sound of wind, not an owl. A long, almost human whistle, echoing from the trees. Then another whistle answered from farther up the mountain. Every tent was awake now. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. For almost 15 minutes, those strange whistles continued, always staying outside the reach of our campfire. Then, everything stopped, just as suddenly as it had begun. Morning arrived with bright sunshine. The strange events of the night almost felt embarrassing to discuss. Until Ryan noticed the ground. Fresh footprints surrounded our campsite. At first glance, they looked human. Except they weren't. Each print measured far longer than any hiking boot among our group. There were no tread marks, no patterns, just deep impressions with distinct toes pressed into the damp soil. 8 of us stood in complete silence. Lucas measured one footprint with his trekking pole, nearly 19 inches long. Far too large for anyone in our group. What bothered him even more was the depth. The impressions were significantly deeper than our own boot prints, despite the ground having hardened overnight. Something incredibly heavy had walked around every tent, very slowly, very deliberately. Ben photographed everything. Every footprint, every stride, every angle. Emma marked the GPS coordinates. Ryan documented measurements inside his field notebook. Nobody suggested following the tracks. Nobody suggested staying another night. Experience teaches you something important about wilderness. Curiosity can become a liability. Within an hour, camp was packed. We headed back toward the trailhead. The hike out felt completely different from the hike in. Nobody wandered away from the group anymore. Nobody stopped for photographs. Every few minutes, someone instinctively looked behind us. Several times, we all had the same feeling, like someone was walking parallel to us inside the trees, always keeping pace, never appearing. 2 days after returning home, Ben copied the photographs onto his computer. Something strange happened. The footprint images were intact. The landscape photos were normal. But every photograph taken between 12:30 a.m. and sunrise contained unexplained visual interference, not blurry, not corrupted. Thin vertical shadows crossed each image as if something had been standing extremely close to the camera lens. Ben insisted nothing had been in front of him when he took the photographs. None of us could explain it. 3 weeks later, Lucas submitted our photographs, GPS coordinates, and written observations to local authorities, along with a request to document unusually large, unidentified tracks found near our campsite. An investigator interviewed each of us separately. All 8 statements matched remarkably well. Time, weather, location, sequence of events. Even the strange whistling. The final report listed no evidence of criminal activity. No indication another hiking party had entered the area. No confirmed wildlife explanation. The footprints were officially classified as unidentified impressions. The file was eventually archived without further investigation. Years have passed since that trip. None of us has returned to that valley. Not because we believe we encountered something supernatural, but because experienced hikers learn to respect one simple truth. Sometimes the wilderness reminds you that being at the top of the food chain is only an assumption. And somewhere inside an evidence cabinet in British Columbia, there is still a police file containing 8 witness statements, 8 signatures, dozens of photographs, and 1 unanswered question. What walked silently around our camp that night, without leaving behind a single explanation? I was 15 when my dog warned me about something in the woods. Olympic National Forest, Washington, 2010. People always ask me why I never hike alone anymore. I usually tell them it's because I've gotten older. That's only part of the truth. The real reason goes back to the fall of 2010. I was 15 years old, and before that day, I had never even heard the word Bigfoot. My name is Lucas. In September of 2010, my entire life changed almost overnight. My parents packed everything we owned into a moving truck and left Southern California behind. My father had accepted a government job that required him to relocate to the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state. Instead of busy highways, shopping malls, and neighborhoods filled with people, we suddenly found ourselves living outside the small town of Forks. Our rental house sat on a quiet gravel road surrounded by towering Douglas firs, western red cedars, and thick moss-covered forests. The edge of Olympic National Forest was less than a 5-minute walk from our backyard. To someone who had grown up in California suburbs, the place felt enormous, beautiful, and strangely intimidating. At night, there were no city lights, only darkness, and the constant sound of wind moving through trees older than the United States itself. Making friends in a new school wasn't easy. Most afternoons, I wandered around the property with my Labrador Retriever Cooper. Cooper had been with our family since he was a puppy. He was fearless, loud, curious, the kind of dog that chased squirrels without thinking twice. He never backed away from anything, at least, not until that afternoon. It was a Saturday. Clouds covered the sky, but it wasn't raining. The air smelled damp from a storm the night before. I decided to explore a narrow logging path that disappeared into the trees behind our neighborhood. I wasn't planning to go deep into the forest, just far enough to learn the area around our new home. Cooper trotted happily ahead of me, stopping every few yards to sniff fallen branches or investigate animal tracks pressed into the mud. Everything seemed perfectly normal. I remember hearing woodpeckers somewhere high above us, a creek flowing nearby, leaves rustling in the breeze. The forest felt alive, comforting even. Then, without warning, Cooper froze. He stood perfectly still in the middle of the trail, his ears pointed forward, his tail lowered. Every muscle in his body became rigid. "Come on, boy." He didn't move. I laughed, thinking he'd spotted a deer. Instead of running toward whatever had caught his attention, he slowly backed toward me. That had never happened before. Then came the sound, a deep, drawn-out howl. Not a wolf, not a coyote. It echoed through the trees with a strange vibration that seemed almost human. Cooper immediately began whining. His entire body trembled. I had never seen him afraid, not once. We continued walking another 100 yards before reaching a small clearing where sunlight broke through the trees. That's when Cooper refused to go any farther. He planted all 4 paws into the ground. No matter how hard I tugged on his leash, he wouldn't move. Instead, he stared into the forest to my right, a section so dense that I could barely see 20 feet inside it. He wasn't barking. He wasn't growling. He was quietly whimpering. Then he let out a long, mournful howl, the kind of sound dogs make when they're terrified. Every instinct told me to turn around. Instead, I looked where Cooper was staring. At first, I saw nothing. Just tree trunks, ferns, shadows, then something shifted. About 80 yards away, between two enormous cedar trees, stood a figure. It didn't step out. It didn't move toward me. It simply stood there. It was taller than any person I'd ever seen. Its shoulders looked incredibly wide. Dark brown hair covered its body from head to toe. Its arms seemed unusually long, hanging almost to its knees. For several seconds, neither of us moved. I couldn't make out its face clearly, but I knew without any doubt it was looking directly at me. Cooper suddenly barked once, the loudest bark I'd ever heard from him. The figure slowly leaned behind one of the massive cedar trunks. Not quickly, not like an animal startled by humans, almost deliberately. When I blinked, it was gone. No crashing through bushes, no snapping branches, nothing, just silence. Then the forest changed. The birds stopped singing. Even the breeze seemed to disappear. Cooper spun around and pulled me back toward the trail with surprising force. He wasn't walking anymore. He was dragging me. Every few seconds, he glanced over his shoulder as if expecting something to emerge from the trees. I didn't argue. For the first time since moving to Washington, I wanted to leave the forest as quickly as possible. We practically ran the entire way home. That evening, I told my father what had happened. He smiled politely, asked if it could have been a bear standing upright. Maybe, except bears don't remain perfectly still for half a minute while watching someone. And bears don't disappear without making a sound through thick undergrowth. A week later, I mentioned the encounter to one of my teachers. She became unusually quiet. After class, she pulled me aside and said something I never forgot. "You're not the first student who's told me a story like that." She refused to say anything else. Years later, after becoming an adult, I learned that unusual sighting reports had been submitted from areas surrounding Olympic National Forest for decades. Most described the same details: an overpowering feeling of being watched, sudden silence in the forest, dogs refusing to continue down certain trails, large unidentified footprints, and a tall figure standing just inside the tree line, never fully revealing itself. I still don't claim to know what I saw that afternoon. Maybe there is a perfectly ordinary explanation. Maybe there isn't. But Cooper never walked that trail again. Even if I carried his leash toward the entrance, he would stop, whine, and pull toward home. He lived another 9 years. In all that time, I never once saw him afraid of anything else. As for me, I still remember one final detail that I didn't mention in my original statement to my parents. When I looked back from the edge of the neighborhood, the place where the figure had been standing was empty. Except for one thing. A single cedar branch, nearly 10 feet above the ground, was still swaying. There wasn't enough wind to move any of the surrounding trees, only that one branch. When I later described the location to a county deputy who occasionally handled reports of unusual activity in remote areas, he wrote down every detail, thanked me for my time, and closed his notebook. His final words have stayed with me ever since. "If you ever go back there," he said, "don't follow anything that wants you deeper into those woods." No official report was ever filed, no evidence was recovered, no explanation was offered, only another quiet story from the edge of Olympic National Forest.